Okay, I want to talk about, in simple summary this week, the Kennedy presidency. Now, this was a short event. Um, he wasn't president for long. A two-term president will serve for 8 years. Roosevelt was president for 12. John F. Kennedy was president for 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days. And hopefully you know why he was only president that long. Because he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963. Now, anybody who has any fleeting appreciation for Kennedy, one way or the other, hopes that he is remembered for more than just getting shot, right? Abraham Lincoln certainly deserves to be remembered for things besides Ford's Theater. And I think the same is true for Kennedy in Dallas. And by the way, the people of Dallas has spent a long time living that down, even though it was the fault of one person, or, possibly if there was a conspiracy, a handful of people. So, all right. So what was it about Kennedy that made made people grieve so much when he was murdered? Well, first of all, he represented generational change. Now, President Eisenhower, who before that was General Eisenhower, was a great, great man, right? He's an American hero for things that he did in the war and then his service later. But the fact is, by 1960, he was old, and he was already kind of a passive, reactive person anyway. And so the 1960 election came down to two candidates who were both under 50. Which, again, I know sounds ancient to you, but in presidential politics, that is extremely young. Think about the age of the current president, pushing 80. The one before him was over 80. It was a generational change in 1960 to get somebody from the World War II. The senior Eisenhower, after all, was the top general in World War II. And he was going to be replaced as president by one or the other person, the Republican or the Democrat, both of who had been junior officers. This is a generational shift. Kennedy, for instance, was a lieutenant junior grade during the war. And so when Kennedy won the election over Richard Nixon, barely, he took office, and it was kind of a fresh start. And he kept saying during the campaign, he kept saying he wanted to get the country moving again. Now, what did that mean? Well, there's domestic policy and there's foreign policy. And Kennedy didn't really, I don't want to say he didn't care about domestic policy. He did. But he was more of a foreign policy president. I mean, during the Cold War, the struggle with the Soviet Union over whether the world is going to be free or it's going to become communist, I won't repeat there's a thing Kennedy said once. He said, compared to something like that, who gives a blank, I'll just keep it clean, whether the minimum wage is $1.15 or $1.25. I'm paraphrasing. He thought that foreign policy was more important. Later on, he got more involved in domestic policy. And I think I don't know that you can call it an achievement, but his concern became in domestic policy for civil rights, because people of color in this country, specifically African Americans, did not have equal rights, especially in the South. And this became a big issue. It was already a big issue. It really kind of started after World War II, because a lot of black GIs came home from the war after serving their country and then found that they were still going to be treated like second-class citizens. And a lot of the civil rights movement came from that. And Dr. Martin Luther King and Roy Wilkins and people like that were the real leaders of it. And Eisenhower didn't want much to do with it. He wasn't a racist, but he's just like, this is not something. He's going to comply with the law, of course, but he's not going to push for new laws. The President Kennedy, came into office. He was only 43, which again seems ancient to you, but that's the youngest elected president in American history. And to this day, younger than Clinton, younger than Obama, anybody. Only Theodore Roosevelt was younger, but he wasn't elected at first, right? He came in because of an assassination. He had really quite an extraordinary group of people in his cabinet, very capable people. But the person who was closest to him, ironically, was, how can I put this? Not necessarily the most qualified initially, because he made his brother, who was only 34, the Attorney General of the United States. But it's not just because he wanted somebody that he could trust, obviously trust a family member. He recognized that his younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who is the father, by the way, of the person who's serving in the Trump administration, just had extraordinary ability. And that became his closest advisor. And Bobby, that's Robert Kennedy's nickname, was interested in civil rights and wanted to use the power of the federal government to make sure that people were treated equally, which I know that sounds like duh, but it wasn't a commonly accepted idea in 1961. For instance, there was a group called the Freedom Riders, and these were people who were protesting, and they were protesting very peacefully. All they did was ride a bus. They chartered a bus and rode from place to place in the South. And it was an integrated bus. It was people who were black and people who were white riding together. And all they were doing was trying to say, hey, this isn't a big deal. Black people riding a bus, big deal. White people riding a bus. We don't need segregation for this. We don't need black and white restrooms at the bus station. We don't need black and white drinking fountains at the bus station. This is stupid. And it was a very peaceful thing. And of course, you will not be surprised to learn they were met with violence. And in fact, they were attacked at a bus station, and a lot of the people who were there were brutally beaten and hospitalized, including a member of the Justice Department who worked for Attorney General Kennedy, a person who had been sent there to help. And there were FBI agents at the scene, and they didn't do anything because they claimed to not have jurisdiction. And so there was this whole fight over this. I mean, something like that would be unacceptable now, right? First of all, the laws wouldn't permit segregation like that anyway. But those things happened because people in government started to try to be the ally of those people instead of the enemy of those people. The laws actually wouldn't come until President Kennedy was dead, until his successor, President Johnson, got them through Congress. But that was the chief domestic concern. And then in foreign policy, Kennedy's presidency came down to a couple of places. Again, only 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days. The first was Berlin, which was divided between East and West. It was deep within the Russian occupied territory of Germany, which was still occupied after World War II. And the people of Berlin in the East were under the Russians, and the people of West Berlin were free. They're under American and British protection. Somewhat French, but they didn't do much. And so the leader of Russia, Nikita Khrushchev, in 1961, built a wall right down the middle of the city to keep his people in. Usually you build a wall to keep people out. He was keeping his people in. And that became a place that everybody was very concerned could start World War III. It would be very easy for the Russians to take over Berlin. It's deep inside their occupied territory. The only thing you could really do is, you couldn't fight them back conventionally. They had a numerical advantage. This is where you could start to get nuclear weapons, and that's where you could start to get World War III. And the fact that it didn't happen is not automatic. It's luck, almost. The other area was Cuba. I mean, I'm really zipping through this because, it's hard to cover something like this in this amount of time. In 1961, the United States sponsored an invasion of Cuba. And what I mean by that is they wanted to get rid of the communist leader of Cuba because Cuba's right there by Florida, 90 miles from the United States. And they just didn't want that country to be communist. And so there was this invasion that was planned when Eisenhower was president. Kennedy came into office and he's like, okay, you can go ahead. And the idea was that a bunch of Cubans who were against this leader named Castro would kind of storm the beaches in Cuba, and it would cause an uprising, and the people of Cuba would rise up and get rid of Castro. And if Of course it didn't work. And the United States was blamed for it because, you know, it was our idea. And so President Kennedy went on TV and basically said, this is my fault. And we're not going to blame anybody else. We're not going to blame the generals. We're not going to blame the men. I am the responsible officer of the government. And people never learn this lesson. His poll numbers, when he said, I messed up, went up, not down, because people liked that he took responsibility. Find me a politician in 2025, Democrat, Republican, anybody, that takes responsibility for messing something up. It's like finding a four-leaf clover. Good luck. But Kennedy took responsibility. And however, that failed attempt convinced the Russians, oh, this boy, we can push him around. And so in 1962, quietly, the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba, which could destroy the United States. We found out about it. I'm really making this super quick. And there was a negotiation, and we were very, very close to nuclear war. The evacuation plans were all laid out. We're going to pick up these people and put them in this fortress, and tens of millions of Americans are going to be killed if this happens. It was a very tense 13-day negotiation. But at the end of the day, the Russians backed down. And that was probably the most important moment of the Kennedy presidency. And that night, he was referencing Lincoln. He said, you know what? He said to his brother Bobby, this is the night I should go to the theater, meaning Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was killed. Because like he had accomplished his victory by saving, I don't want to say saving the world, but preventing nuclear war. Maybe it did save the world. And his brother said, well, if you go, I want to go with you. And obviously he didn't really go to the theater, but a year later, a little more than a year later, 13 months later, the president visited Dallas. He was on the verge of running for re-election in '64, and Texas was going to be an important state, and so he visited actually all the big cities. He was in Houston and San Antonio, and had huge crowds, and drove through the streets in the convertible, huge friendly crowds in all of these cities. And the last big one was Dallas. And then that night he was going to be going to Austin for another motorcade, and that night would spend the night at the LBJ Ranch with his vice president. But he didn't make it. While riding in a convertible in downtown Dallas, he was shot and killed. People have believed for decades that there was a conspiracy. I personally would like to believe that myself, because otherwise it means this loser, Lee Harvey Oswald, this lone nut, changed American history. And look, I wasn't there. This was 10 years before I was born. I wasn't present. But if you gave me a time machine and said, go back to Dallas and stop the assassination, you got one chance to do it. There was a movie about this, by the way, but just play along. You got one chance. If I can go, I only have one chance. I'm going up to the 6th floor where Lee Harvey Oswald was, because I guess I'm betting Kennedy's life. I would bet that that's how you stop it, because I think it was Oswald by himself. The ballistics evidence lines up perfectly from a shot above and behind. A lot of the mistakes that were made in the investigation gave people the wrong idea. If you look at the footage, it's very gruesome. I don't advise it, of the assassination. He seems like he's going backwards, and that makes people think he was shot from the front. But there's a whole forensic explanation for that. Maybe on some level it doesn't matter whether it was one person or a conspiracy. The point is, he was gone. And that was the beginning of the end of this feeling of American innocence. A bright, happy mood is shattered by an assassination. And then Lyndon Johnson becomes president and does some big, important things, some great things. Civil rights and Medicare and Medicaid. A lot of the great society stuff was very important. Head Start programs, aid to higher education, did great things, but also led the country into Vietnam, which was a disaster. And so Kennedy's murder, one of the reasons that people still focus on it decades later, is that was a turning point. Things for a lot of people have not seemed the same since then. Johnson had a problem telling the truth. Nixon had a problem telling the truth. Some presidents that came afterwards, although they were honest, they weren't honestly very effective. Ford and Carter. That was the one brief shining moment that they talk about, the moment of Camelot, which is the nickname that is given to Kennedy's presidency. It wasn't perfect, but it represented a time that just seemed like a good time, like a good era, like a good time to be alive. And then in one moment in Dallas, it was gone. So, all right, this is by far my longest. I tried to keep it short. I'm going to wrap it up now. Write this up, answer the questions, and we'll go from there.